Thank you. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I pulled together this presentation with this audience in mind. And I would like to try to motivate some discussion of what I think are some controversial issues. I'm an economic historian, an economist by training. I presented most of this to audiences of economists, but I'm writing a book and I would like for that to address a larger audience. And I'll show you some of the issues that I think my empirical work has some bearing on. Okay, and I want to get to that in the end, and hopefully that'll be my last slide, and we can have some conversations about that. Okay. Now the title had the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on African economies, 1440 to 1800, I believe. So the first part of the talk is my effort to make good on that promise. These are some recent articles that I've written, some by myself, some by Rob Gilzu, who's a graduate student at the University of Michigan, where we've gone into some GIS analysis of some of the data that I'll present to you today. And there's a huge development literature as well that is beginning to work backwards in time. It's trying to explain inequalities across countries today by looking at the colonial experience, and then the pre-colonial experience, and then ultimately the slave trade in Africa as it pertains to Africa. Nathan Nunn is the most famous example of that, where he's found that those countries that participated most in the slave trade are less developed today within Africa itself. And his sort of mechanism for the persistence of that over this 400-year period is an effect on trust levels amongst people. That just the process of enslaving others, and people tend not to think about the actual process of what I call the production of slaves. But if you think about it, it's a very violent process and should have some lasting ramifications. Well, Nathan Nunn has sort of found some of those, some evidence of that. Okay. Now, these are some of the issues that I think my work has some bearing on. And I'll just go over them very quickly here. Skip Gates wrote this New York Times article on the blame game, where he's talking about reparations and who's responsible for what as it pertains to the slave trade. And he claimed that Africans were involved in the slave trade. They're the ones who sold his people. And so therefore the blame game's over, you know, unless you're going to blame them. I think I have something to say about that debate. If you look at popular culture, these are some words from Bob Marley's famous song, Buffalo Soldier, stolen from Africa, brought to America. The Roots film had the same thing. The WPA slave narratives claim slaves in the 1930s were reflecting on the origins of American slaves and had a story about them being stolen from Africa. Okay? I want to say something about that. Then there's a strange career of agency where African scholars are sort of going overboard, trying to assign agency to Africans. Okay? I think they go way, way too far on that because they have no idea what the structure of the slave trade is. Okay? And I think I can identify the structure, and so I can put the individual decision-making within context of will versus force. Okay? Then John Locke's justification for investing in the Royal African Company was that his force and his society was not producing slaves, but just sort of trading them after they had already existed within Africa. I think I could say something about that. This one's about the shift from indentured servitude to slavery in the New World. It's always sort of explained as if there's zero marginal cost to the production of slaves, and it's really driven by transportation costs. Transportation costs decline, fewer indentures enter into indenture contracts because it's easier to finance the costs across the transport costs across the Atlantic, but it reduces the price of slaves because the transportation costs being the primary determinant of the price of slaves. Okay, here is my kicker. I want to move away from a discussion of the slave trade and towards a discussion of the production of slaves. Now, some people sort of take me to task when using that term, but I want to focus more on the actual physical, violent process of eliminating one's rights, enslaving them, and then moving them to the coast and exploiting them. I think that act itself is the source, the fundamental source of the persisting negative effects of the slave trade on African economies, okay? And in the process of doing that, we say something about Philip Curtin's work and sort of side with Patrick Manning on a controversy in the historical literature, okay? So I said I was going to save that to the end, but I didn't. Okay, so here's what I want to do today. I want to start with this long view, what I call from the Gold Coast to the Slave Coast, just to put the slave trade within historic context. Talk about the economic structure of the transatlantic slave trade, focusing primarily on the British slave trade because the data are best there. Okay. Then talk about the fundamental impact on Africa of an increase in the export demand for Africans as slaves. The impact of that on African economies. And here I'll focus on presenting some empirical evidence that actually increases in the prices of slaves, generated by increases in sugar revenues in the New World, actually forced a reallocation of resources in Africa away from other things and towards slavery. Okay? If I don't find that, it's going to be pretty hard to argue that the slave trade had an impact on Africa one way or the other. Okay? And I interpret that as Africa engaged, so really some of the blame game disappears there because it's really about supply and demand, Africa and Europe. Then I look at the dynamics of slave supply, and that's typically referred to as a black box because we have very little even direct observation on how that happened, because it happened in the interior. During this period of time, Africa is non-literate, and really many of the literary evidence that we have from this period comes from either Muslim observers from the north or European observers from the coast. And they're not seeing this, so it's sort of referred to as a black box. What I'm going to do is look at the relationship between gunpowder imports as a proxy for guns in the British slave trade and see if I can econometrically identify a relationship between that gunpowder import and slave exports. Identify that as a supply side relationship, not a demand side relationship, because guns can be exchanged for slaves. After controlling for that, I then see if there's any additional effect of guns on slave exports, and then I actually estimate the supply function and run it through some robustness checks to make sure what I'm getting is this black box. Okay? And then I look at the impact of export demand on African institutions in the late 19th, early 20th century. And here I go to George Murdoch's data on the structure of ethnic groups in Africa, both their geographic expanse and their political structure. Okay, and I find enduring effects of the slave trade on these institutions. Okay, so that's where I want to go today. So I have half an hour to do it. So here we go. Here's the long view. Here what I've done is I've calculated the purchasing price of an ounce of gold in the city of London. Okay, from 1252 to 1931, when Britain went off the gold standard. Purchasing power of an ounce of gold in the city of London should, in a sense, reflect the value of the gold produced in Africa. And during this period of time, Africa has almost a world monopoly on the supply of gold to Europe. Okay, if any of you are familiar with, here's Columbus. Right, here's the Portuguese going down the coast of Africa looking for the gold. Right, here's where they build Elmina, right at the peak. You can see why they're exploring down the coast of Africa. The value of gold in Europe is pretty high. Okay, but this is also a sort of proxy for the value of gold to Africans. African miners who are selling it across the Sahara Desert and to the Portuguese on the coast of Africa are getting something like this. Not all of it, but if it goes up, they're probably getting more. Okay? What I want to show here is that this is sort of the golden age for West Africa, for the Sudanic West Africa. Here's Mansa Musa's pilgrimage. And we know a lot about Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, captured by a lot of observers. Made a pilgrimage to Mecca, traveled across Africa to Egypt, supposedly took an entourage with him so large and so much gold that he inflated the Egyptian economy for a decade. Apocryphal, but it's in the Kantalan encyclopedia. We have pictures of it, the whole bit. That's way back here. That's not even the golden age. We're talking about Mali, Timbuktu. That's not even the golden age. Okay? So, and there's lots of other evidence of development in the Sudan. This is slag mounds found at a place called Bagou, which is just on the verge of the forest in Ghana. And lots of other pieces of evidence suggesting that there's some pretty good economic development happening here. The Iron Age is really taking off, textiles really taking off, international trade, earning international exchange. And then it levels off and some other things happen. In fact, here, where the value of gold really plummets in the 19th century, we begin to see some gold coinage. The gold hoarders are getting rid of their gold because the value is declining so fast, and they're beginning to circulate what's called a Niki Mithqal. Mithqal is an Arabic coin. Niki is down near the forest in the Benin Gap, around the Benin Gap. Okay? So that's the long view. There's a whole history talking about the development of this region around these gold fields, cola trade, a coastal trade from Benin all the way over to the Alcan gold fields. Rich history of what's going on. Here's the slave trade. This is the same graph, the value of gold, same graph. This is the value of, or rather I should say, it's the price that British slavers were willing to pay for enslaved Africans starting in 1699. Okay? And you can see, boom, and all the calculations on the value of the slave trade versus the value of the gold trade, by this time, the gold trade is nothing. Everything, the game in town, is the slave trade. Okay? And that's an 18th century phenomenon, and that's the period of time we're going to look at here, and I believe that's the period of the slave trade that has the most lasting effects on African institutions and economies. Okay? And there's the sugar story that's behind that 18th century demand. Haiti and Jamaica are the main stories there. Okay? Okay, so here's the slave trade. The overarching context of it is that it's a sale trade. It's got to follow the currents here. Here this is Africa, Europe, America, Caribbean. Okay? The Arab traders came down to this point way back in 1200 or so. Couldn't get beyond it because every time they did, they couldn't fight the winds, the currents to get back, and they had to return by land. It's the Portuguese that made innovations in the sail technology that allowed them to sail against the wind. And then once they did that, it took another 70 years to get down to the coast, down to the Cape, because again, they're sailing against the wind. And ultimately, the Portuguese sailed way out here to go around the coast. Some argue that they stumbled upon Brazil, kept a secret from the Spanish, and got the Catholic Church to give the Portuguese Brazil. Right? But here, this is the part I want to focus on. This circle here is the natural support for the triangular trade. Okay? And the slave trade up in this region here was indeed a triangular trade. The slave trade down here is very different, but the Brits never got down here. The Portuguese dominated this trade from Brazil. Okay, once they got that, the Dutch tried to get it from them. That's why they took part of Brazil and the Cape. They were trying to dominate this lower segment, but they can only do that for 50 years. Portuguese got it back. This is the one we're going to focus on. Okay, and we're going to use data that the Brits, God bless them, collected on this trade to get a better understanding and empirical accounting of the structure of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay? All right, so first thing is the length of time for that circuit. Here I've taken some numbers from the transatlantic slave trade database. This is all of the voyages, and it should be British slavers, 1699, 1807, because that's what we're going to focus on. The number of days it took to get from Europe to the Americas, not back to Europe, but from Europe to the Americas. And I would say it's somewhere between 200 and 400, maybe, you know. But about a year is a good thing. I mean, we're not far off. This guy up here, you know, he was out there for almost 3 years. Found his way back. That's the funny thing. Found his way back. I don't know where he was, but. Okay, so about a year. And that's going to be important for identifying that gun slave cycle. Okay, so here is some discussion of the structure of the trade. It was very risky for Europeans. If you look at the price fluctuation, you'll find that it's a random walk. Okay, it's a random walk, which means that the best guess that one could do about next year's price is to just take last year's price, okay? And then just go for it. Just look into the past. What was that price? Make your decisions based on it and go for it. Okay? They were also backward looking in terms of the investments that were that were made in the slave trade. There is no relationship between the value of goods leaving England for the west coast of Africa and the price of slaves on the coast of Africa. No correlation whatsoever. So it's not like high price means, hey, let's send some more goods to Africa. No. What determines the value of the working capital, the commodities put it on those ships and shipped to Africa in exchange for slaves, is sugar revenues in the New World. So the idea here is that a ship is leaving Europe, goes to Africa, picks up some slaves, takes it to the New World, sells those slaves, and then while in the New World, evidence, information about what's going on the sugar plantations and what's going on, what price are they getting in Europe. That feeds then those investors in London and Birmingham, and where were the Beatles from? That was another. Liverpool. And the merchants there then say, okay, the sugar industry is booming, let's invest more in the slave trade. Okay, but they're not looking at Africa, they're looking at the West Indies. Okay?